Well, you might have noticed that a few things are a little different this morning as we head into Advent. Today is the first Sunday of Advent, and if you're not sure what Advent is or what it means, it's the celebration of the first coming of Christ. It is the reminder that God took on flesh. There is this connecting of the dots of we celebrate Christmas, not necessarily because of the manger or the gift giving, or it is to wrestle with a deep, unfathomable truth that if we try to apply our brains to, it becomes extraordinarily difficult. It is the infinite God, one with no boundaries, with unbelievable power, that spoke everything into existence, took on flesh. It is the reminder of how much God loves us. It is the reminder of the sacrifice of God. It is the ongoing celebration of the elevation of humanity. It is this idea that God, in his fullness, chose to step down out of glory and take on flesh, to become human, to condescend to us, to be able to, for us to be able to understand who God is. He took on flesh. You've got to dwell on that. That's got to be part of the relationship we have with God. It has to be. It has to be part of our tension of understanding the fullness of God and the greatness of God and the qualities and characteristics of God that are far beyond us. God is other. God is spirit and holy and all those things. But yet, he chose to join us here in flesh. That's Advent. That is the reminder. It is to lead into the birth of Christ, the first coming. And we look to the second coming, but right now we look back on that first coming. And with that, we begin to wrestle with our own humanity. We begin to wrestle with, do we really see God as we should? And do we understand that he is ever present? He is always with us and always around us. And what does that look like? See, we worship the self-proclaiming Messiah. His name is Jesus. He came as light in the darkness. And we believe that Jesus is God in the flesh. I mean, we let those words roll off our lips, but really the Advent season is the celebration of that. And it's core to our belief. And Jesus announces it himself in John chapter 12, verses 44 through 46. He says this, "Then Jesus cried out, 'Whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness.'" How could the light come into the darkness and people not see it? You just heard from the Innkeeper, obviously there was something going on there. There was something happening that night when Mary and Joseph arrived. But people missed it because it was very ordinary. It was very ordinary. Ordinary people. Joseph and Mary were not unusual. Everybody was doing what they needed to do. They were going to their place to register. People were part of the Roman Empire and doing their thing. And I'm sure he had seen many other people come through. And so it was ordinary. Jesus came into the world in an ordinary way. And there's something about that you and I, as followers of Christ, need to see and wrestle with. Is Jesus ever present? Yeah. The Holy Spirit in the church, and then we come together and Jesus is present. When we are alone in our homes, The Spirit is present. He is ever present. He's ever present. The question isn't whether or not he's there. The question is whether or not we're attuned to the fact that he's there. And so this comes to us in this way as a light, okay? Jesus comes as a light, and somehow, some way, in the midst of darkness, people don't see the light. When my kids were young, we had a book called Cars, Trucks, and Things That Go. It was by Richard Scarry. I don't know if any of you have ever seen those books. But each page is full of characters. It's a kid's book with cars and trucks and planes and all kinds of things that go. So that's the name of it. And on each page, as you open it up, it has a glow bug on each page. And part of the fun of the book is to find the glow bug on each page. And so you would find it, sometimes it was in the window of a car, sometimes it's by a fire hydrant, sometimes it was in places like in the window of an airplane or whatever. It was on each page, and part of the fun of reading the book was finding the glow bug. And the idea was, is as you read it and you went through it, is eventually, we went through that book so many times with our kids that the cover wore off and there were pages missing, and it's one of those books that was just a lot of fun. But as you turn the page, as the child gets a little bit used to it, they're picking out the glow bug as you turn the page because they were familiar with it. They knew what to look for. They knew where he would be because they were attuned to the book. Some of you may have been more familiar with Where's Waldo? Where's Waldo was books written in the UK, I think back in the 60s. Anyway, here's a page from a Where's Waldo book. And the idea is that you got to find Waldo in the midst of all that. And you've got to be able to look in such a way that you are attuned. He's not hiding in the page. It's not that he's hiding. It's just that he blends in. It's that he's part of the picture. He's hard to spot. Now, the danger of doing this is now everybody's looking at that thing, trying to find Waldo, which I get. From what I understand, there's several people told me he's up in the right-hand corner. So stop looking, look up in the right-hand corner. But the idea is that on each page, you begin to tune your eyes to look for certain things for Waldo. You may have heard that you may have seen actually T-shirts in the 70s, 80s, where Where's Waldo was huge. Like there's this, so he stood out. But I think this is a better picture of kind of us and Christmas time. If you could think of Christmas as that mess up there, and we ask the question, where's Jesus? In the midst of it. It requires us to tune our eyes. I actually went on Google and I Googled, how do I find Waldo in those pictures? And there's a list of ways that you find him. And I know Google's got everything. But what you find is they said he always wears certain colors. So you learn what he's usually doing something he likes to do. So you look for things that he likes to do. And he's never ever in the lower left-hand corner of the picture. And so you learn certain things. There was a bunch of other things. Those are the three that stood out to me. I've never looked for Waldo, never liked the idea, but because I could honestly care less where Waldo is. But the idea is that once you learn, like my kids with the glow bug on those pages, they learn where you would be. They knew what to look for. They knew. I think finding Jesus at Christmas time is a lot like finding Waldo. He's not hiding, but he is there. And we need to be aware of what he's doing. We need to be aware of the fact that he's ever present. We need to be attuned to what to look for. I think that's the struggle at Christmas time. Because in the midst of the way our culture does Christmas, the weirdest thing happened to me on the way here this morning. And I struggle with how this fits in, but it stuck with me all morning, and I mentioned it in the other two messages, and I got lots of feedback on it. So I'm riding in the car, I'm listening to the radio on the way here, and an ad comes over the radio that Bibles on sale for $5.99 at, I can't remember the name of the place that they're selling them. They're King James Version Bibles, and they're $9 cheaper than you'll get at the box store. So the ad is very clearly trying to sell more Bibles than the other place. So now we're in competition on selling Bibles. So in my mind, I'm listening to this ad, and I'm listening, and it struck me that we've put the Bible on sale, and it struck me that you get it at a discount, and then it struck me that somehow we're in competition for selling the Bible because we want to make a profit on the Bible. And so I turned it off, and I sat in that for a few minutes. And I don't even know what to do with it, really, other than there was a realization. I'd never heard an advertisement on the radio for a Bible before. I was in the North, and no one ever talked about the Bible, so there's something with the Bible Belt that goes with, and this wasn't even on a Christian station. This was on some other station. There's confession, right? I wasn't even listening to a Christian station on the way to church. But I didn't even think of that until now. There's certain things I probably shouldn't confess, right? But there's something about our culture. There's something going on culturally at Christmas time that feels a little off. This feels like something wrong with that to me. And you may be sitting there going, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just trying to get more. This is what somebody said. Hey, cheap Bibles, that's what you want, right? Get more Bibles into people's hands. I mean, you want a cheap Bible, just download one on your phone. They're free. So in my mind, I just wrestled with that for a while, with this idea, with this thought of Christmas and the connection to Christmas and the idea that our culture moves into this place. It moves into this place where it feels like everything is up for grabs in some respect. We sell stuff, we make profit, we do things, and all of that somehow is jumbled into a season in which we're really celebrating the idea that God took on flesh, that God stepped down that something incredible happened 2,000 years ago, 2,000 plus years ago. And so in the midst of all that craziness, in the midst of all that's happening, there's a tension of where do I find Jesus in that and celebrate this idea of Christmas. And as we come into the Advent season, as we have a month of this, we've already had a month of this. It started right after Halloween, October 31st. I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the amount of noise that Christmas generates in our culture. It dominates it. And in the dominating of Christmas, or in the dominating of our culture with the idea of Christmas, I think what's happening is Jesus is lost in it. And I, as much as anybody, can get lost in it. And so with that is, how do we see the light in the midst of the darkness? How do we begin to be able to tune our eyes and tune our ears to hear that which he wants us to hear? Or we, just like the innkeeper, will miss him. We'll just miss him. And that in and of itself during this season would just be tragic if we would miss God. And the thing about it is God doesn't show up in the ways that we expect him to. And I don't like that terminology because he's always present. He's always there. It's sometimes very subtle, and so we assume he hasn't showed up. God's here. God's ever present. God is always with you. God is a part of this idea of a ever present person who lives and resides within the very souls of his people, that when they are gathered, it manifests Christ himself. That's a big, big thought, and it's a big nugget that needs to be unpacked at a different time, but that's the church. So when I use the word that God showed up, it is a man-made idea that somehow he hasn't. He's always showing up because he's always present, okay? So when I slip into that mode, because it's a vernacular that we're stuck with in some ways, and I'm going to try and not to. But in the first place, when God showed up in Bethlehem, he came in the most unlikely package. If you were God, and you could arrive on earth in any package you could come in, and you were going to save the world, would you show up with poor people in a stable in a little town called Bethlehem outside Jerusalem? Well, see, the answer to the question is, well, of course, because that's the way God did it. That's the right answer. But in our heart of hearts, right? If I can make up whoever I get to be, and I get to decide who my parents are, he's the only guy that got to decide who his parents were. Right? He picks Mary and Joseph. And he arrives on the scene in a very ordinary way. No fanfare. Missed. Just missed. Under the radar. Even though he was prophesied that this is the way it would be. That the prophecy of long ago said he would come to Bethlehem, that he would show up. He would be this God in flesh. He would be the Savior of the world. He would be the King of Kings. He'd be the Lord of Lords. He would be the wonderful counselor. This guy was going to show up. You would think, wouldn't you, that people would be, I need to be aware of this happening. I should live expectantly. I should tune my eyes. I should tune my ears to the coming of this God, King, child. Sound familiar? See, that story is the same story we wrestle with, right? We look back on the first coming, but there's a second coming, and we are to live expectantly. That's a different story. But God shows up in an unlikely package, in an unlikely place. He didn't meet people's expectations, and people were just too busy to notice. They weren't really looking for him. So they didn't know it when he showed up. Is it possible the same is true for us, that we can't see him when he shows up? Again, I use that word for the idea that somehow, some way. See, when we use the word God really showed up, we're speaking of we finally noticed. It isn't that he's done anything differently. It's just that our eyes were open, our ears were attuned to what was happening around us, when normally we're not. Which is a little troubling, because most of the time we're not expecting him. See, a lot of us look for Jesus in our traditions at Christmas time. We look at it and we look at it through the lens of, tradition of we open presents, we give and receive presents, and I think Jesus is in that. It is the expression. I think the expression of giving and receiving gifts is an expression of God. It is generosity. It is receiving something from God and then in turn giving it away. It is the picture of our relationship with God. Giving and receiving gifts is great, except for when it turns into about me. But maybe Jesus shows up in that for you. Maybe it's just that moment when you sit down on the couch, the dog is sitting next to you, the Christmas tree is lit, there's a nice glowing fire. It's colder than 60 degrees outside, so you can enjoy the fire. There's a warm spot, a cup of coffee, a book to read, and you go, this is Christmas. This feels like Christmas. Or maybe it's when your family gets together and there's a moment of togetherness with peace. Like there's no arguments. And you go, this is Christmas, And then you go, well, God showed up because there was peace. But sometimes we just miss him altogether. We don't give him a second thought. And herein lies the struggle. See, the innkeeper in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, you got to give it you got to give him a break because he was busy, right? You also got to give him a break. He was not expecting Jesus to show up that night. You got to give the innkeeper a break because he had no clue. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. See, at this point, a lot of people just tune out because they've heard this so many times. We take for granted what we hear. And, I've heard it on TV. I've heard it in a million different ways. But this is an amazing account of the arrival of God. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. How would you like to be the innkeeper and you realize what you did? That God was born in my stable. Missed him that night. Is it possible to miss out on one of the most significant things that ever happened in history? Between that, on the church calendar, there's two significant events that we celebrate, that we mark on the calendar. One of them is the birth of Christ, and the other is the resurrection of Christ. Easter and Christmas. Is it possible to miss out on that? Yeah, even when it happens right in front of you. Because we just weren't looking for it. It's much easier to see what you are looking for than it is to see the unexpected in the midst of the swirl of life. I'm going to say that one more time. It is much easier to see what you're looking for than it is to see the unexpected in the midst of the swirl of life. Why would you ever take note of anything ordinary? Jesus' parents were ordinary. His birth was ordinary. His entry into the world was nothing to distract an innkeeper from his routine. It was ordinary. And part of that should settle on us a little bit, is to say, okay, if God is in the ordinary, what do I need to attune my eye to? One of the things that I over the years as a pastor struggle with is a little bit is you've seen the portraits of Jesus' face, right? And they go out of their way. Good looking guy, got nice hair. It's got and those portraits are probably pretty fraudulent. They're a guess, and the guess doesn't take into account that Jesus was ordinary. I want to read for you from Isaiah 53:2. And it's describing Jesus for us. He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. So if you could pick your parents, right? And you pick ordinary, and you could pick the way you look any way you want. He picked ordinary. It almost sounds mean. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was ordinary. Culturally, can you imagine? Yeah, but Jesus is ordinary. In his appearance, he was ordinary. Now, granted, he was God in the flesh, and he was extraordinary. But it wasn't about his appearance. And it wasn't about that look. It was about who he was. I think a lot of people just walked by him as a carpenter and said he's a carpenter. And there was nothing about him that attracted them to him. It was ordinary. So we probably need to adjust what we're looking for. It's like looking for Waldo on that page. You have to decide, you have to learn a little bit about what you're looking for so that you can spot him. It's not that he's hiding. Don't mistake what God is doing as hiding. You're just not looking. I have a confession to make. I am a Viking fan for years and years and years, and we call ourselves Viking sufferers because they are inevitably breaking our hearts. But on Sunday afternoons, I like to watch football games. I like to watch the Vikings. In case you don't know, they're the Minnesota Vikings, and I'm talking about the NFL. What I've learned is I have to describe this better because a lot of people here just don't watch the NFL. And the DirecTV, we have DirecTV so I can watch the games, and DirecTV has a channel called the Red Zone channel. And the Red Zone channel is you can tune to the Red Zone channel and watch it and while all the games are going on, and it gives you all of the great plays. It gives you the plays where they're going to score, so they take you to the game that somebody's going to score. And sometimes there's like 3 games on the screen at the same time. So if you are a football junkie, it's like the thing. I like watching it when the Vikings aren't playing because I like to watch the game in such a way that you learn the nuances of the game. A football game is kind of a story in and of itself. It can take you to heights of euphoria, and in case of the Vikings, it can take you to depths of despair, all in a 3-hour experience. And sometimes it leaves you exhilarated, and sometimes it just makes you, why do I care, right? And many of you are going, yeah, it's football, why do you care? But I think the Red Zone channel is a good example of how we view how God works. And we watch the Red Zone channel and say, oh, these are the highlights. This is the best thing. This is where God shows up. And we get to see all the fun scores, but we don't see the nuances of the story. We don't see the prayer behind the event. You don't see the faithful workings of people behind the scenes. All you get to see is the quarterback throw the ball, score a touchdown, everybody cheers, and that's the highlight. It's like watching the halftime show. It's like watching ESPN. They just show you the stuff that's fun to watch. And that's not ordinary. That's highlight reels. Now, trust me, God has his highlight reels. He's got highlight reels that dwarf everything. And just read the Old Testament. There's highlight reels. Read Jesus' ministry. There's highlight reels. He raised people from the dead. But in the ordinary stretches of life is where we see God at work. I struggle with this as much as anybody does because I get so busy, and you might be sitting there going, well, how do you do that? And during Christmas, how do I do that, right? It's so crazy busy. How do I see God in the midst of all the craziness? Where's Waldo? In the midst of all that. Here's the number one principle. If you're going to walk away with anything today, turn off the Red Zone channel. You're not looking for highlights. Allow the finer, ordinary things of life to speak. But in order to do that, you must ruthlessly carve out hurry from your life. And what I mean by that is you must have margin or space in order for you to slow down and see. If you are in a hurry for everything you do, you will not see the ordinary. You won't. And you will not see God in the ordinary. You will just go through life looking for the highlight reel. The best thing about watching a highlight reel is it doesn't take much time. You don't have to watch the whole nuances of the game, but there's something in a block. There is something in a running back who gains 2 yards running up the gut that set up a play action pass for a touchdown. I know, half of you are going, whoa. But if you're watching the nuances of a game, if you're watching the nuances of life, if you're involved in the whole story arc, you begin to understand that for every person that was healed of cancer, there were 40 people that were praying faithfully for years. And you hear of the person that's life was changed and somehow was overcoming addiction and overcoming. You begin to hear the stories of the people behind the scenes that were praying and counseling and walking with them. But we see the highlight reel of God changing a life and the miracle of that. But behind all that is the ordinary nuances of God's work. And we never see it. I shouldn't say never. That's a bad word. We seldom see it. Because what we're fixed on is this. See, it's not an accident when we see God. It's actually sometimes startling when we see God because he shows up sometimes when we don't expect him to. And we actually process it that way. Boy, I didn't expect God to show up in the way that he showed up. What that tells me is you've already tuned your eyes to the way that God will show up. And so you have to take a different perspective. You have to take the glasses off that you've created by which you decide when and where God shows up. And put on glasses or fix your eyes in a different way. That's the struggle of Christmas. I think the traditions of Christmas and all the things in the trappings of Christmas for us culturally have decided this is the way I see Jesus, or this is the way I see God as he shows up at Christmas. And I would beg to differ that he is always present. He is always there. He's always showed up. He's always present. I'm convinced we just don't see him. Because we are too busy. There isn't enough margin and space because we are in a hurry and we do not see the quiet whisper. We do hear the quiet whisper. We don't see the glimmer of light in the midst of the simple things that are going on around us. So what should I be looking for? What should you be looking for as we enter into this season? And one of the things I've learned is people always talk to me about the way people drive here, and I love it, and I know I've used this example a few times, but this is a different one. When I sit at traffic lights, and I'm sitting to go straight, and there's a left-hand turn like this, everybody kind of been there? When the light turns red on this side, and I get a green to go this way, there's usually about 6 cars that go through that intersection. Ever experienced that? If you haven't, then you're not driving in Tennessee. And it's a very irritating thing for somebody without margin who wants to get going when the light turns green. And so I'm sure there are times when I've looked at people with great disgust as they've driven by me. Light's red. Maybe some of you have seen me say it that way. So I tried something different this last week because I knew I was going to be speaking. I'm going to smile at these people as they drive by me. And the most fascinating thing happened. They smiled back at me. Except for a couple of people who were like, what do I do with that? I don't even have it. Because they're so used to somebody going, what are you doing? The only reason I tell you that is there's ordinary. There's routine. And you find yourself in the routine of, if I have no space or margin in my life, smiling at people that hold me up is not an option. It's not. I am guilty I have no margin. I'm in a hurry. I've set just enough time to get where I need to get to, and now I got to wait for these 6 people to go through the light that shouldn't have gone through the light in the first place. Now I'm ticked. Instead, I thought, I'll smile at them. It changed something about me and for them. I'm sure one of them went to their office and said, you wouldn't believe what happened. There's this guy sitting at the light, and he was green. I went through the red, and he smiled at me. Who does that? I think Jesus presents himself clearly in kindness. Hear me. When we are kind, we reflect the heart of God. Rather than hostile, it might be an overstatement. Not, some of you definitely are hostile. Some people came up after this 10 o'clock gathering and said, yeah, definitely hostile. But there is a nuance to the ordinary, because what they expect is not what they should receive. See, again, you begin to recognize when God shows up. See that word? It's often in the ordinary. It's letting that one person cut ahead of you in line at the grocery store that looks like there are no margin in their life. And they're just crazy Herod, and you let them through. And you wait a few more minutes for But we don't think that way because we think in terms of our own hurried schedule. Again, I want to call you to this idea. You want to see God and you want to see him clearly. You have to have some margin. There has to be space. Don't let the season crowd out space. And then you have to tune your eyes. You have to tune them. You have to tune them to where he is. And it's in the ordinary. It really is. I know the extraordinary happens, and we celebrate the extraordinary. And I'm all about the extraordinary. But when somebody says to somebody else, please forgive me, I was wrong, God was there. Because it just is so rare. Without excuse. Without anything else. Just to say, man, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Forgive me. And see God in that. Because he's there. And so kindness and gentleness and gift giving and generosity. See, he's showing up all over the place because he's ever present. And I'm asking you to join me into refocusing on seeing him in all of that. You're not looking for something that's hidden or hard to see. What you're looking for is something that is obvious and plain and ordinary, but extraordinary in a culture of hurry. It is that you're looking for. And if you can be somebody who has provided yourself margin and space to be able to see and hear, you will see and hear if you tune your eyes, tune your ears, focus your eyes to see. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for these few moments that we can have being reminded of the amazing gift that you took on flesh and dwelt among us. And that even in the midst of being here, you came through ordinary ways, through ordinary people, in an ordinary place. And you did not make yourself extraordinary in appearance, just extraordinary in your person, so that we might know you. Thank you for elevating humanity in that you've valued us enough to join us here. And thank you that we can celebrate your coming and be reminded over and over again of your ever-presence with us. And thank you for your deep love. And I pray that we abide well during this season. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.